Hi, welcome. My name is Lynette, and this is All Things Development. This is a channel that will touch on development issues affecting sub Saharan Africa. Today, we are going to be looking at land reforms in South Africa. So, what is land reforms? Land reforms is the equitable distribution of land in a country, and many times you find that maybe there are people who are landless in a country and there's a need to redistribute this land so that there can be equality in the country. So in South Africa, what caused the land inequality? Actually, as per 1994, when South Africa gained its independence, 80% of the land was owned by the white settlers. And of course, that meant 20% of the land was being occupied by 90% of the population. You can see there's already a problem with this. How did that happen? There was this Land Act, this law that was passed in 1913, which was called the Native Lands Act of 1913, whereby it said that Africans could not own land, Black South Africans could not own land, they could not be sharecroppers. It just completely pushed them out of the land they were occupying. And over time now, especially now with apartheid coming in 1948, it meant there was a segregation between the white settlers and the black South Africans. Black South Africans could not stay in the same place as the white settlers. They would be pushed now to townships and also reserves whereby no one owned that land because it was communal land that was run by chiefs, and traditional hierarchies of leadership. So we found that a lot of Black South Africans lost their land this way. They were forcefully evicted from their land, and the white settlers took this land and began farming, large scale farming on this land. So there was an inequality. That was the inequality that happened during that time. So once South Africa gained its independence under the president Nelson Mandela, the land reform policy was formed. And first of all, the first thing they did was to revoke the Lands Act of 1913 that said that Africans could not own land in South Africa, and they could not have tenure of properties and all these kind of things. It was revoked. So that was the first step. But the land reform policy had three components, which was land redistribution, land restitution, and land tenure. So land redistribution was that now the government was now to give land to landless black South Africans, And how were they to do this? They were to buy land from the white settlers in a program called Willing Buyer, Willing Seller model. It's a market-led reform system, which is different from the state reform system, whereby the state owns all the land and then now it decides how the land is used and how the land is distributed. So this one was more of like, we want you to sell your land. Will you sell us our land? The white seller is like, yes, I will sell it at this and this price. Then the government buys it and then goes and sells it to the black South Africans at subsidized price, and also with a loan. They provide a loan under the SLAG, Settlements Land Acquisition Grant, that was providing loans for black Africans to be able to buy this land and then to be able to pay it over a number of years, up to 30 years. So that was the scheme. And under this scheme, it was supposed to, the plan was to have 30% of the land that the white settlers had should be reverted to, black South Africans. This willing buyer, willing seller led reform actually failed because, as we see, that program was to happen in 5 years. That's now black South Africans would have 30% of the land. But to be honest, as in if we look at it around now, it was only about 8% of the land that has been able to be redistributed to black South Africans. We are talking now 25 plus years later. So that was a fail, and And there were several reasons why this was a fail. So let's move on to land restitution. Land restitution meant that restoring land that was taken forcefully from African settlers. So what happened under that act I told you about of 1913, there were people who were forcefully ejected from their land and they owned their land. So the scheme was, if you prove that you own the land, you have written evidence to show that before these white settlers who are there right now had the land, we were living here for the longest time, we were living here for the last 100 years, that is our land. If you could prove it, then you were restituted that land. The government would probably buy it from the white settler and give it to the black communities. That and quite a number, in fact many communities have been restituted their land. That has been done. It's just that the percentage is way less than the target of what they had wanted to do in the first place. Lastly, the tenure reform was whereby now black South Africans could have property rights. Before, it was not possible with the apartheid system, whereby you'd find now people were staying in townships, land reserves, and the land was communal. So now, by law, it was, black South Africans who stayed there for a long time, they could own that land. They could be able to get titles for that land. So that was more of a legal system. Now you have stayed in this land for such and such a time. We need now you to have property rights, because it's not enough just to say, I've stayed in this land, me and my grandparents have stayed in this land for like 50 years. You need a legal document showing that we actually own this land and we've stayed in this land for it doesn't even have to show how long you've stayed. You just need the legal document to say this land belongs to me. So what were the challenges with the land reform? Why has the success rate been so low? There are a number of reasons. Firstly, we know that 60% of black South Africans stay in urban areas. So that leaves about 40% in rural areas. The government gave people the option to either take the money that was equivalent to the value of the land, or else take the land. Usually the compensation, if it was financial compensation, you'd find that it is not equivalent to the land. So, but still, because let's say you don't have the capital or the know-how of running a farm, you'd rather just take the money and go and live in the city, because you've always lived in the city anyway. So that was a challenge. Another challenge is the budget allocation for the land reform policy. It was at a meager 1%. 1% of the whole national budget was put, and this is so jarring, because that should not be the case. This should have been a high priority case whereby this is the first thing they should have been doing. So 1% was very little allocation, and that's why maybe a lot of red tape, bureaucracy, and such like things. There's also been a lot of corruption, especially with the last government, whereby Zuma government, they lost about $17 billion, could not be accounted for from the state coffers. This money should have been allocated for important things like land resettlement. That was a problem. Then also a challenge that black farmers got when they bought their land and started farming there was, first of all, many of these white settler farms were highly mechanized. They were actually doing commercial farming for export. So you find that you're being given a big piece of land and you do not have the technical know-how, neither do you have assistance, especially from the government, to how to run such huge farms. You might not even have the capital, because agriculture is capital intensive. You need money for fertilizer, water, you need money for the machines. So then many of the pieces of land that have been given to some of the black farmers have just lay fallow. There's no much farming that has gone on, because not too much support was offered to them. So that was also a challenge. And another challenge, I think I've talked about also droughts. That's another challenge. There've been droughts in the land. So maybe you've actually grown your crop, but you've harvested very little, and you have a loan to pay to the government, and you also need to, make your profits. So that was challenging for the farmers. There not too much access to credit and the markets. That's also been a challenge for the Black farmers. Um, Apart from the budgetary allocation, you also found that another challenge of the land reform policy was the white settler farmers were actually overpricing some of their farms. So some of the land that the government bought, probably because of not researching enough, or maybe just loopholes in the system, they bought the land at exaggerated prices. And sometimes the land was not the best quality, so some of the land that was sold for was not ideal for farming. Another thing was some of the farms had accrued debt. So when the Black now settlers were now supposed to start farming on the land, some of them discovered that there was debt on this farm, and probably the former owner has left the country. Where will we get the money to pay off this debt so that we are able to continue with farming on this land? So there were challenges. Also, I think lack of transparency in the whole system, and because of it taking such a long time, there's been a lot of uh, opposition backlash to the government. The opposition are asking, why has this not been done now? How come there are so many Black South Africans? As we know now, 37% of South Africans are unemployed. So that is a very high percentage. And then now you have um, landless South Africans, and this should not be the case, because actually, something else that I had forgotten was that they were also farms that the government owned but had not allocated. So they've already bought the land, yes, from the white settlers, but they've not allocated to the Black farmers up to now. And to bring those numbers a bit home, there were, I think at around 2017, there were around 4,000 farms that are state owned, but only 900 of those farms have been allocated to Black South Africans. So that is dismal. So because of the pressure, the opposition EFF have been run by Malema. They have been pressuring the government that we need to nationalize land. We need to nationalize banks. That's their agenda. And because of election time and election period, the ANC decided to come up with something called expropriation without compensation. And that was tabled in 2017, as probably as a result of course, the failed system that has been in effect, but also the pressure from the opposition. And it's the opposition has so much traction, actually, because the number of people unemployed plus the landless people, who might even be the same people, they're like, yes, it's time for change. So because of that pressure, they came up with expropriation without compensation. And I remember the international community was up in arms. This cannot happen. This will be another Zimbabwe. Anyway, as per now, the parliament actually shot that bill down. So it's not going through. And I also don't think it would actually help the country, because it has the potential of creating chaos. A forceful eviction of white settlers will cause ripples in the international community, probably sanctions. So that's one thing I know that leadership in South Africa don't want to go down that route. So now what can be done about this situation whereby now there are no, still the society in South Africa is so divided by inequality. One of the things that has actually been working is partnership with the private sector, whereby the private sector can provide the markets. And also there's been a framework where it's called 50-50 framework, So what happens? The government buys the land, then leases the land to the farmers and the farm workers. So now they have that partnership, whereby the the farmer and farm workers will come and form a company, and this company will pay the government for whatever the lease is. Yeah, instead of now redistribution. So that has also been working, and also partnerships between the private companies and communities are actually working when they come together and say, okay, let's say 50% will take 50% of your, we'll take 50-50. So whether you get losses, whether you get profits, we are in here with you until the very end. That is working because the private sector can provide credit, can provide the capital they need. And and also the government is now looking into technical assistance of training the farmers and giving them the know-how of running these farms. Those facilities are available and have been available. Probably it wasn't done in a maybe a systematic way to make it work. That was probably the problem, not so much the constitution, to change the constitution. um so what does the future look like? I think the future looks like a hybrid solution of this, not just a one. It cannot either be just market-led reforms, or it can't be this. The government needs to really try to help the black, settlers, and also the black farmers. And also another thing, I had a scholar saying that you don't have to learn how to run a farm. You can actually just lease the land to someone. That's privatization, right? You can actually just lease that farm and get the profits, because as we have heard, 60% of black South Africans are in the cities. They may not be interested to run these farms. They would rather either sell the land, or else just leave it fallow. So instead of just leaving the land fallow, and it's productive land and it's arable land, why don't you just, have a partnership with private companies, so that you're able to run the farm, but you also have legal ownership of that farm. So that's where land reform is in South Africa. It still has a long way to go, but it needs, and also another thing, the government needs to completely put all its efforts and all its resources in budgeting for land reform, because as we speak, it's only 1% of the national budget that is looking into land reform policies and land reform projects and agencies. There's an agency that has come up to help expedite these cases, but the budget cannot be 1%. This should be at least at 10%. So the government has a big responsibility to actually speed this up, but I believe it can be done, but it needs to be done in urgency. Otherwise, these racial tensions actually, and having a very unequal society always spells, it always spells bad things. It's never a good thing to have an unequal. You never want to have a society where you have the rich, are super rich, and the poor are just poor, and there's a huge gap. You want a society where you're closing in on the gap, so that most people can afford to have a decent life, decent education, decent housing. Yeah, so that's it for the South African land reforms. And on my next vlog, we'll be talking about Zimbabwe and the land reforms in Zimbabwe. So join me, and if you like the content of my channel, you can subscribe at the subscribe button. So that's all for now. If you have any questions or comments, just write them down. Okay.